There's some access controls that you can have with S3. So you can use identity and access management to control the access to S3. You can also have S3 bucket policies. You can have ACLs or access control lists as well. You can have presigned URLs. And what is presigned URLs? It's basically a link that is generated, and we're going to talk about this a little later. It's a link that is generated from multiple ways, right? That you can give your end users so that they can download or upload files to S3. And this is time bound. This has a limitation. So the owner, the one that creates the link, is the one that sets the time for expiration. Also we have encryption. You can encrypt the data either at rest or also from the client. And we're going to talk about some security best practices in AWS in terms of S3. Now, IAM policies, what they do is basically specify what actions are allowed or denied on what AWS resources. For example, we can have EC2 terminate instances on the instance with instance ID such, right? So you can attach IAM policies to IAM users, to groups, to roles, which are then subject to the permissions that you have defined. So in other words, we can say that IAM policies define what a principal can do in your AWS environment. On the other side, S3 buckets policies, what can do is they're attached only to S3 buckets. So S3 bucket policies specify what actions are allowed or denied for which principals on the bucket that the bucket policy is attached to. For example, allowed a user, for example, John, to put but not to delete objects in the bucket. So S3 policies are a type of access control list or ACL, but we have to understand that ACL here is a generic term. So you shouldn't confuse this with S3 ACLs, which is a separate S3 feature. We're going to discuss that later in this presentation. Now you attach an S3 bucket policy at the bucket level, right? So you can attach a bucket policy to an S3 bucket, right? Uh, but the permissions specified in the bucket policy apply to all of the objects in the bucket. So you attach it at the bucket level. Now, this is the S3 bucket. Now we're going to see now an example of an IAM user policy and also an example of a bucket policy. So this is what we have now, right? So this is an IAM user policy. So the user policy allows this particular users to put or get objects into the reinvent bucket, as you can see, right? So in this case, we have the effect allow, write, and read, right? And then the action is S3 put object and S3 get object. So those are the actions that are allowed for in that particular resource, which is the bucket SAA prep sessions and everything in it. So that will affect all the objects that are inside that bucket. So that will be a specific IAM user policy. And then we have here an Amazon S3 bucket policy that allows principals from AWS account, all these number ones here, to read object from that same bucket, SAA prep sessions bucket, but it has a condition that limits it to objects that have a specific tag value. So that is a condition that you can add as well, putting it a tag to even more specific, be more specific when limiting the access to an S3 bucket. So these are two different ways that you can restrict the access to a bucket, whether it is using an IAM policy that is attached to a person or an identity. In this case, it could be a principal or it could be an application. And also it can be attached to a group or a role. And the S3 bucket policy is attached at the bucket level, and it can also affect the objects inside that particular bucket. Now, let's talk a little bit about the access control list, right? A moment here. So in this case, right, as a general rule, AWS recommends using S3 bucket policies or IAM policies for access control. So S3 ACS is a legacy access control mechanism that predates IAM. So however, if you're already using S3 ACLs and you find them sufficient, there's no need to change. You can continue using S3 ACLs. Now, an S3 ACL is a subsource that is attached to every S3 bucket and objects, and it defines which AWS accounts or groups are granted access and type of access. So when you create a bucket or an ACL or an object, Amazon S3 creates a default ACL that grants the resource owner full control over the resource. That's what happens by default, right? You can tweak that later, but that's what happens when you create a bucket. So you can attach S3 ACLs to individual objects, right? Within a bucket to manage permissions for those objects. So S3 policies and IAM policies define object level permissions by providing those objects in the resource element in your policy statements. So the statement will apply to those objects in the bucket, like we said before. So consolidating object-specific permissions into one policy, as opposed to multiple S3 ACLs, it makes it simpler and easier for you to determine specific permissions for your users and role. So um, we have this, right? So in the bottom line, line one, right? So we just, the bottom line is just access control lists are legacy, but they're not deprecated, right? So that's something to be considered. So like I say, if you want to continue using it, you can still use it. Now, bucket and IAM policies are recommended by AWS, and ACLs give control over buckets and objects. Policies are only at the bucket level. So you have to decide which to use by what considering important things like use S3 buckets if you want to control access in S3 environment, know who can have access to the bucket, and always stay under 20 kilobytes of the maximum size of the policy. And in terms of IAM, if you want to, you use them if you want to control access in the IAM environment for potentially more than just buckets, manage very large number of buckets, know what a user can do in AWS, control access, and all that. So that's something that needs to be considered when uh, just using either IAM policies and S3 bucket policies or S3 ACLs. Now, talking about pre-signed URLs, this is something that is very, very, very important because what happens with pre-signed URLs is that the one that creates the link, what it does is it embeds the credentials of that owner into the link, and that link can be shared with other people. For example, let's say that we are doing a training with some audience, and then the audience they want to receive the PowerPoints of the training. So usually what is done is those PowerPoints are turned into a PDF file and then they're shared with the audience. But sometimes it's too many PDF files, and it's hard to share them through email. So what happens is that you can upload those PDF files or maybe a compressed file that is impossible to send through email because it's too big, but you can generate, once it is uploaded in the bucket, you can generate a URL, a pre-signed URL, and share that URL with the audience with, for example, 2 days of expiration. And then after 2 days, those people, no matter how many times they click on the link, they won't be able to utilize that because it expires already. So that's basically the the intention to use a pre-signed URL. There are multiple ways that you can generate a URL. For example, you can use the S3 console, so you can do it manually. You go to the console and do it from there. You can also use the AWS Explorer in Visual Studio if you're a developer and you're using Visual Studio. You can also use the AWS SDKs, so you can generate that URL with code from your text editor, or you can simply use the CLI, the AWS CLI. So you could go ahead and configure the CLI, entering your access keys, and then you can go ahead and write a command and specify the expiration date or in seconds, right? And then you go ahead and run that command, and it's going to generate an, a link which you can share with the audience, and that way they can go ahead and do either a get or a put depending on the operation they're doing. And when I say get, they just download, or put, they just upload files, right? So this is very important, and also you have to be cautious as well, because whoever gets access to this URL during that time when it's valid can do these operations, you know, and if that's not the intended audience, that will be a problem, right? So we have to be careful with that, because basically that link has my credentials as the owner of the link. So that's very important, right? So that's how it works. You can send it from the client. It just accesses that bucket, and it goes ahead and lets you download or upload uh, objects into S3. So that's basically what a pre-signed URL can be used for. Now, caution here, that's very important. Also, there's another feature in S3, which is public access, right? And what is public access? Where any anonymous or overly permission access is considered public access. So anytime there is public access in your bucket, that's a security risk, right? That's a security risk. If you create your account with ICE and Guard, right, and for any chance you create a bucket and you leave it public, right, and then you forget about it, you can be easily paged in the middle of the morning, 2, 3, 4 a.m. in the morning from the security team, right? It's an automated action, and then they can ask you to restrict the access to your bucket. So you have to block off all the public access. That happened to me once. I was sleeping comfortably at 2 a.m. in the morning, and I got a page, and then it was like a siren, like an ambulance, just just passing by my house with a very loud sound, right? So I have to wake up and go ahead and stop the page and change the access to my bucket. So that's very important, right? So access control list with grantees such as all users, anyone on the internet, that is also public access, right? Any authenticated user, anyone with an AWS account, this you know, is too permissive, right? Too permissive. And that's not good. Remember, we have to follow, and that's one of the best practices in terms of security in AWS. Always follow the principle of least privilege. You only provide users the access that they need for the job, and only that, nothing else. So that's very important to understand. What else is public access? Well, a policy with overly permissive access, for example, here, the principle is any principle, the resource is any resource. That's what the star means there. It means everything is just a placeholder that replaces everything. It's a wildcard. Action, put object, effect allowed, principle, star, resource star, action. All these conditions, that's very permissive. So that is basically uh, public access. And any explicit cross-account access is not considered public access. So in this case, it's not considered that. So just remember that, because that's very important, right? Now, what do we have to do with Amazon S3 block public access settings? So basically, what we do is we block new public ACLs and the uploading of public objects. So every bucket by default is private, right? So if it gets public at some point, it's because we explicitly make it public, right? So something else that we can do is remove public access granted through a public ACL. That's very important as well. We can go to ACL and remove the public access. We can block new public bucket policies. That's very important as well. So make sure that the policy has access, not overly permissive, right? Just a specific um, access, not uh, too open, right? And block public and close account access to buckets with public policies. So those are the things that we can do in the settings of the bucket to be able to block the public access. Now, in terms of encryption, right? In terms of encryption, we have encryption in transit. That's something that we can enforce, right? And how do we do that? Well, everything that arrives in the bucket has to be either HTTPS secure or TLS transport layer security. So those are the ways that we can encrypt the traffic that's coming, right? It has to be that. So we can enforce that. If the traffic that is coming in, if that request that is coming in to upload a file, for example, in S3, doesn't come with that in the header of the request, then we can reject that, right? So something that we can enforce. Now, we can also have server-side encryption, right? And we have multiple ways to encrypt the data at rest, right? So we have SS3, S3. So basically, what happens is when you use this type of encryption, basically each object is encrypted with a unique key. So as an additional safeguard, it encrypts the key itself with a root key that it regularly rotates, right? And this uses one of the strongest block ciphers available. It uses 256-bit advanced encryption standard, or AES 256, to encrypt the data, right? And 256 is basically the length of the key that is used. It has 256 bits. So we also have S3 SSE. S3 is similar to SSE S3. We have a KMS, which is the second one is similar to the first one, but with some additional benefits and charges for using the service, right? So there are separate permissions for the use of KMS key that provides added protection against unauthorized access of your objects in Amazon S3. It also provides you with audit trail that shows when your keys were used and by whom. So it uses CloudTrail as well for that. So you can create and manage customer managed keys, right? That will be the other one. That one, it helps you have more control over the keys, SSEC, and that's good as well when you want to have more control with your keys. So you manage the encryption keys, and Amazon S3 manages the encryption. So as it writes to the disks and decrypts the data, when you have access to your objects, it works that way. And the final one is client side. So you can encrypt the data with AWS encryption SDKs. So basically, you can use code, like for example, you use Java, and you can create a class, right? That helps you create an Amazon S3 client with client-side encryption enabled. So once this is configured, what happens is any objects that you upload to Amazon S3 using this client will be encrypted. So any objects that you get from Amazon S3 using this client are automatically decrypted. So they're encrypted when they're loaded, and they're automatically decrypted when they are downloaded. So that's the different types of encryptions that you can use in Amazon S3. We also have Amazon S3 object lock. So basically with this, you can store objects using a write once, read many, or worm, right? WORM model, right? So object lock, what happens is it can help you prevent objects from being deleted or overwritten, right? For a fixed amount of time or indefinitely. So you can use object lock to help meet regulatory requirements that require warm storage, or to simply add another layer of protection against object changes and deletions. So this is very important as well, and this is another way that you can even more protect your objects in S3. It basically provides two different ways to manage object retention, so you can retain retention period and legal holds. So those are the ways that you can retain those objects when once they're locked, right? With the legal hold, which is the one that is a little more strange to it comes to legal and all things. Basically, when you have this type of ways to manage the retention of the object, right? It provides the same protection as a retention period, but it has no expiration date. So instead, a legal hold remains in place until you explicitly remove it, right? In the case of retention, it just expires after a certain period. With legal hold, you can have it there indefinitely until you explicitly remove the hold, right? So multiple ways that you can help your buckets be more um, secure, right? This is also good for auditing and visibilities, right? Just you have an auditor visit you and they want to inspect your logs and things like that and your securities, and you can show that you have this type of feature enabled, and that way you can keep those logs for the future, right? And make sure that you can track, report, and have alerts about the access and retention changes that happens um, in your S3 bucket. And last but not least, we have the Amazon S3 security best practices. So these are the things that when creating a bucket, we have to think about, right? If you want to make sure that your objects, both your bucket and your objects, are secure, right? So first, when you create your bucket, don't change the block public access settings, right? Because by default they're blocked, right? So enable that if they're disabled. That's very important. Enable encryption of REST. So this is very important, server-side encryption. You want to make sure that your bucket objects are encrypted, right? Also, by bucket policy, make sure that everything that comes in requires TLS, right? So you want to encrypt that those requests in transit, you want to encrypt that. Use VPC endpoints, right? Enable and require. Make sure that with bucket policies and they have limiting access. When you have VPC endpoints, you want to access um, the buckets privately, right? Inside the VPC, creating a VPC endpoint. We talked about gateway endpoints before, so this is what it's referring to. Also, versioning. So enable versioning. This is very important, right? Because if you delete an object in a bucket that doesn't have versioning enabled, that's going to disappear and there's no way to recover that object, right? But when you have versioning, every time that you load the same file, right, it creates a version of it, right? And then if you delete the file, it doesn't delete the file entirely. It creates a delete marker in the versioning section, right? And it will be there, right? So that's very important when you create versioning. Also, if someone steals the um, the object, right? Someone has a security bucket and gets the information, you still have a version, and also you can kind of roll back to a previous version of that particular object. Something very important, if you're going to be resilient and you want to have um, kind of a disaster recovery plan, you can enable cross-region replication to have the data replicated to another region. That's very important. And last but not least, you can have MFA delete, which is almost always accompanied with versioning. So you can have MFA delete. So the person that tries to delete the object, they have to authenticate themselves using MFA. So multi-factor authentication. And also object lock for governance and auditing and compliance and all that. So that's all I have about S3.